Hello, my name is Lisa Fitzgerald and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Rennes. Today I'll be talking about how sensory embeddedness has translated into digital and new media aesthetics using John Gerard's digital simulation, Western Flag Spindletop Texas 2017, as an example. I argue that there is an integral performativity in new media artwork that can contribute to a deeper understanding of the anthropogenically driven environmental crisis. So firstly, a brief explanation of the historical event itself that the artwork is depicting. On January the 10th, 1901, a wildcatter named Anthony Lucas drilled into a salt dome formation on Spindletop Hill, Texas, and the ensuing oil eruption has since become notable as the environmental event that augured the petroleum age. In the rush to harness the oil, Spindletop and the adjacent town of Beaumont boomed from a population of 8,000 to 60,000. Over 1,500 oil companies were chartered within the year. By 1903, over 400 wells had been drilled in the area and the landscape had changed beyond recognition. The region was decimated as oil exploitation trumped social, environmental and civic concerns. The visual iconography of the event, captured in photographs and reprinted in postcards, reinforced in the public mindset the bountiful image of the oil gutter. For World Earth Day 2017, digital artist John Gerard created a CGI simulated rendering of Spindletop, which was broadcast intermittently throughout April 22nd on Channel 4 and live streamed on their website, and also was an LED wall installation at Somerset House in London. It is a socially engaged artwork prompting questions about the exploitation of fossil fuels and the impending catastrophic impact of anthropogenic climate change. The simulation consists of a tabula rasa landscape with a flag of black smoke around which the viewpoint rotates. The installation makes use of military and computer gaming technologies to parallel the real-time environmental changes in the Texan landscape. Firstly, this is the process with how the artwork is created. Firstly, the site is surveyed, in this case using drone technology, to create a comprehensive photographic archive. The photographic data is then transferred to a 3D model and the environment is reconstructed as a virtual and temporal world using game engine technology. The result is a piece of software that issues continuous instructions for the creation of a frame-by-frame simulation of the real Spindletop. It is a live enactment to Spindletop. As reviewer Ben Eastman writes, quote, "Every image is both unique and instantly discarded, meaning that the work is closer in spirit to the live interpretation of a score than the transmission of pre-recorded information," end quote. It is not intended as a representation, but a live interpretation of the landscape. What is evident is how Western Flag operates from a place of what Trevor Paglen calls machine vision, where, quote, "digital images are fundamentally machine readable regardless of a human subject," end quote. This phenomenon of digital imagery, quote, "allows for the automation of vision on an enormous scale and, along with it, the exercise of power on dramatically larger and smaller scales than have ever been possible," end quote. Just as Paglen points out that computer-generated imagery can operate outside of human vision in ways that traditional photography could not, Western Flag runs algorithmically, whether the observer is involved or not. What is left of the landscape is the silent enactment of a century of oil exploitation and its impact on the environment and its inhabitants. On the one hand, it is a fateful rendering of the site, but it is also an invented space with a flag marking the mediated version. The visibility of various actants, to use Latour's term, in networks of energy, such as that of oil, is a crucial part of the renegotiation of hierarchies of power that is active in contemporary cultural discourse. The simulation can be seen at different times of the day and night in a slow panning shot around a barren and desolate landscape. Western Flag draws our attention to the site as the locus for not just the emergence of Texas oil and the resulting American expansion, but an environment that has endured an environmental catastrophe. Whereas contemporaneous images of the Lucas Gusher showed figures dwarfed by the scale of the eruption, The landscape in Western Flag has no human presence. The activities that brought thousands of prospectors to the region, bringing oil harvesting technologies such as the derricks, have long since disappeared. The remnants of oil fires and spills that were collected in the imageries that served as popular postcards at the time now shadow a landscape that has been laid to waste. In Western Flag, it is as if the past has had such an all-consuming impact on the present that they both collapse into this arrested version of time. The environment now resembles a scorched earth landscape, but the impression left by the artwork is not that of a redemptive beginning. This is an end point, a ground zero. Poisoned or decimated landscapes have previously been represented in art, many emerging from apocalyptic narratives, some depicting the boomtowns of American capitalism, such as David Hansen's photographic series Atomic City, for example. Others use the moment of crisis itself, such as Hei's recreation of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in miniature called Is There a Horizon in the Deep Water from 2011. But tied in with the notion of the apocalypse is redemption. After all, the word itself means rebirth, and the idea of redemption is notably absent from these sites. These spaces are laid bare. Western Flag is a wasteland. The palette is flat and lifeless, and the flagpole is staked in the centre, demarcating a land that lies devoid of value, at least on human terms. Out of the pole, seven plumes of smoke steadily poison the air, perhaps referring to the Seven Sisters, the common moniker for the 7 oil companies that control global oil production. The black smoke that columns from 7 nozzles create the impression of a nebulous plume, an object that suggests on the one hand grieving or mourning, and the other a burned flag, a violent act for which the surrounding terrain could arguably become so like the landscapes that have been exploited in the intervening century. The flag is an attempt to make the carbon dioxide emissions that suffuse the history of the site more tangible in the mind of the spectator. The smoke points to the invisible matter that pervades the environment. John Gerard commented in the press release that, quote, one of the greatest legacies of the 20th century is not just population explosion or better living standards, but vastly raised carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. End quote. The proliferation and indeed the impact of carbon dioxide since the oil strike at Spindletop is concentrated in the elusive smoke that spiral out of the nozzles and is strengthened or weakened by the prevailing winds. The material interaction between toxins and bodies and the impact rendered by exposure is evident in Western Flag. The digital simulation as a virtual object mirrors the assumed immateriality of unseen components, such as the buildup of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Visual representations of oil disasters tend to fall into 2 categories, according to Caroline A. Jones and Peter Gallison. First, there is the visceral close-ups of, quote, pathetic oil-drenched creatures, seagulls, pelicans, turtles, dolphins, safe in human hands, end quote. And secondly, the satellite photographs of oil on the sea surface, quote, reminding us that such distant tragedy is the very stuff of the sublime, end quote. The first is distinct in its materiality, the oil-soaked animal overcome by the toxic fluid that has played such a huge part in the global domination of one species. The tragedy of the oil-covered animal is countered by the sublime beauty of the satellite photography that makes up the second category. But with the Deepwater Horizon oil spill came a new imaginary, according to Gallison and Jones, one established by the footage captured by the BP underwater camera, which directly captures the oil gushing from the pipeline, quote. Of all the spill images, those provided by this camera were the only ones to be unprecedented, installing in our techno-imaginary the live feed of oil billowing from BP's broken wellhead to form its own imaginistic gusher, defeating all the technical verbiage, quote, static kill, top kill, side kill, blowout protector, and proving so incendiary that it took considerable effort by Representative Ed Markey to pry it from BP's proprietary control, end quote. The continuous footage emerging for the live feed provided the spectator with an ongoing sense of the effective interaction, to use Karen Barrad's terminology, due to a large part in the due in large part to the live actualization of the events. In the case of new media, it is the impact of the algorithmically generated moving image that has transfixed the contemporary observer of environmental disasters. There has been a change in the temporality from real time to time that is encoded through computerization. What Paul Virilio defines as machine vision, where, quote, one of the most crucial aspects of the development of new technologies of digital imagery is the relative confusion of the factual and the virtual, the ascendancy of the reality effect over the reality principle, end quote. The rise of the reality effect is clearly evident in the conflation of aerial photography and real-time technology used to portray Spindletop. The assumption of authenticity is relayed through the technology in what Virilio calls the emerging, quote, automation of perception, end quote, which delegates the, quote, analysis of objective reality to a machine, end quote. The visual iconography of oil gushers can be one of uncontainable abundance, the flourishing that is tied in with the fulsome image of oil as a sustaining economic development. In 1901, spectators came to view the Lucas gusher in the thousands to marvel at the event. Catherine Morris has pointed out that contemporaneous media focused on the scale of the gusher, end quote, captured oil's serendipitous abundance, power, and naturalness, end quote. It was seen as a gift that reinforced the deterministic narrative of Western expansion. It heralded an era of petromodernity that Stephanie Le Ménager has described as having since, quote, enveloped the Euro-American imagination to the extent that oil has become implicitly synonymous with the world in a large Heideggerian sense of the human inframing and revealing of earth, thus the earth we know, end quote. The social and cultural implication of a century of exorbitant oil consumption has meant that the material aesthetics of oil generally fall into two categories, abundance and devastation. In both categories, the sheer immensity of the scale is evident from the Lumière's brothers' quote, title, Oil Wells of Baku, close view from 1896, to the recent pervasive seepage into everyday social living conditions, as Le Ménager writes, quote, the human body has become, in the wealthier parts of the world, a petroleum nature culture, to use Bruno Latour's term for the inevitable intermixture of the self-generating organic and the made, end quote. It is pervasive and all-encompassing because, quote, it has supported overlapping media environments to which there is no apparent outside that might be materialized through imagination and affect as a palpable hope, end quote. Many contemporary cultural representations of oil depict environmental devastation and the ties to neo-capitalist infrastructures that underpin it. Oil narratives have been framed in such binary terms that what has been omitted in these stories is the more nuanced role of the embodied spectator in oil's infrastructure. Not just the body of those immersed in the oil-ridden society that Le Ménager points out, but by those engaged in the consumption of the oil spectacle. Many contemporary cultural representations of oil depict environmental devastation and the ties to neo-capitalist infrastructures that underpin it. The use of oil is not only endemic in the tools we use in our everyday lives, such as the proliferation of plastics, but it is the energy without which, if fears regarding the end of fossil fuels are realised, contemporary ways of living would collapse. Societal dependence on oil means that in many ways the environmental catastrophes that result in excavation and use have been overlooked. Janet Stewart has written on the case of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill that, quote, oil, in particular of its production and consumption, can be best grasped as the central node of a particular assemblage which overlaps clearly with the two great alloplastic and anthropomorphic assemblages that Deleuze and Guattari identify in 1,000 Plateaus, the war machine and the state apparatus, end quote. Oil, plastics, human and non-human bodies, and the social and cultural and economic structures that envelop them have become uneasy bedfellows in the newly demarcated Anthropocene. Contemporary visual representations of oil blowouts, further earlier late 19th and early 20th century messages of oil as a metaphor for abundance. But current digital and new media artwork, with its emphasis on embeddedness, which in turn highlights the corporeal materiality of the human body, leads to a focus on the institutional and structural dynamics of oil. Works such as John McCormack's 50 Sisters from 2012, which comprises images of algorithmically generated plant forms derived from oil company logos, illustrate this viewpoint of oil stemming from and built into the social and economic and environmental structures. With computer-generated imagery such as Western Flag, there is an opportunity to focus on the temporality inherent in new media artworks rather than the interactivity. The temporal dimension of new media artworks foreground if those artworks are ecologically driven and environmentally minded, material non-human narratives. Latour distinguishes between matter as object and shows relative disdain for reductive materialism and a materiality that counters the current trend, quote, de-animating the agencies we encounter at every step, end quote. We should not be apologists for attempting to narrate non-human actors, but should strive to find new ways of articulating and celebrating, or at least acknowledging, both the difference between and yet familial relations with other agents. Rather than trying to reconcile with nature, Latour argues, the crucial political task is to, quote, distribute agency as far and in as differentiated a way as possible, end quote. New media art plays a crucial part in this new aesthetic built upon material agency. Western Flag is a time-based digital artwork that links ecological materiality and the ecocentric narration of non-human nature. The flag of black smoke at the centre of the artwork and around which the viewpoint pans is a symbol of the power and geographical specificity, something that counters the hegemonic powers underpinning petrocultures. The hitherto pervasive materiality of oil and non-specificity of the infrastructures surrounding and processing it has since been overwhelmed by the flood of plastic pollution. The dynamic between oil as energy, immaterial in the same way that capital is deemed to be, the substance itself, and the oil as the ultimate material item. Plastic illustrates just how pervasive it is. In Western Flag, Gerard deals with the aftermath of that process and the remains of an industry that overwhelmed the community or landscape from which it originated. The immaterial dimensions of the artwork is evident in the digital coding of the landscape and the positioning of the flagpole as a reminder of the structural undercurrent that plays a role in the facilitating of these energy systems. But the temporal aspect of the artwork tethers the viewer to the landscape in real time. Not unlike phonology, temporal computer-generated imagery, like Western Flag, track the impact of the passing of time and its effects on material actors. This relationship relates to the natural rhythmic time in the body of the observer, an awareness that is cognizant of the dynamics of the moving image. Temporality rather than interactivity, which has also played a fundamental role in new media practice, is central to Gerard's work. There is a difference in Western Flag and other computational applications, in that the framing of the environment takes precedence over the interactivity of the user or spectator. One of the challenges for visual aesthetics that is thrown up by gaming technology is the seemingly permanent blow to traditional artistic perspective. The result is a fracturing, William Oricchio argued in the, quote, long regime of three-point perspective and its reification of an underlying understanding of subject or object relations, end quote. Traditional perspective, as illuminated by the Heideggerian position of the world conceived and grasped as picture, emerges through the human as subject. Oricchio points to the algorithmically enabled application Google Street View as evidence of the dismantling of three-point perspective and in its place an algorithmic, quote, intervention in the subject-object relationship, end quote. The result is a total and temporal environment that breaks with traditional notions of framing. Gerard's artwork is representative of Spindletop, but is also a valid environment in and of itself. It is not an attempt to capture an accurate representation of a landscape, nor is it an apocalyptic vision of the future. Le Ménager discusses the use of screens displaying natural environments to hide ecological eyesores in relation to the 1930 Olmsted and Bartholomew plan to regenerate Los Angeles. She describes them as, quote, attempts at a faux atmosphericity that covers the sights and sounds of industry producing biochemical effluents already building towards the smog crisis, end quote. In many ways, Western Flag counters that narrative of concealment. The environment displayed is Spindletop in real time in all its harrowing emptiness.